Je suis triste que je ne parle pas français.
Oh, c'est excellent. C'est excellent.
C'est nécessaire que je parle anglais, mais si je parle trop vite, s'il vous plaît, dites à moi. Arrête. D'accord? I should stop now. So the title of this conference is The Human Person in the 21st Century. And as Dennis has mentioned just before, one of the characteristics of this century we are living in is an increased number of people who live increasingly long lives, and that often means that those people have long periods of time when their lives are ended in dementia. So the question that I am struggling with today has to do with the identity of someone who, after being an adult for a reasonably long time, enough time to come up with her values and ideas, now falls into irreversible dementia, perhaps because of Alzheimer's disease. So how do we understand the identity of this person who now has dementia and who used to be not demented? Is she an entirely different person whose likes and dislikes and values are disconnected from the person she was before? Or is she better understood as the same person who has now changed from her former self, but still basically another version of that former self? We okay so far? Okay. So the law seems to give one answer. Even if I forget my own name in history, my spouse cannot marry somebody else. My spouse is still married to me. My son cannot yet inherit because I'm still alive. My social insurance check still comes to me, and so on. So I still seem to exist in the world as the legal person that I was before. On the other hand, this fall in the US, the Supreme Court took up a very intriguing question. Does it violate the US Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment to execute a convicted murderer who has such severe dementia he no longer remembers what he did? So he's being executed for a crime he cannot remember doing. But that's another problem for another time. So these questions could send us down deep philosophical pathways. But today I want to look at a more practical problem. Should we respect the advance directive of people who are now demented when those directives arguably are against the current interests of the demented person? So let me explain again. Imagine that somebody, I'll call Jane, good American name, Jane number 1 is a competent person, and she makes a document. These are legally, somewhat legally enforceable in the US. She makes a document saying what she wants to happen to her if at the end of her life she's no longer competent to say what she wants. We call that an advance directive. It directs what should happen in the future. So Jane number 1, competent woman, writes that advance directive. Now she becomes demented. We can call her Jane number 2. And And the question is, should we follow Jane number 1's wishes about how to treat Jane number 2? Okay? Why should we or why should we not? Let me give you an example, a story. Let's imagine Miss Snyder, Madame Snyder. She's 90 years old. She has Alzheimer's disease. She has lived in a nursing home for 5 years. She has outlived her siblings and close friends. She never married. She has no children. But Madame Snyder had a long career as a foreign correspondent and could often be seen on television news. You know Christine Amanpour? You know, sort of like that, you know, the long hair and the helmet and the black vest and reporting from Afghanistan and wherever, right? She fought to stay in her home as long as possible, but as her dementia progressed, her nephew Larry intervened and arranged the nursing home placement. Now, before dementia struck, Madame Snyder had written a detailed advance directive, naming Larry, her nephew, as her healthcare proxy. In the US, these directives have legal force, and she stated clearly that if she were ever to become cognitively compromised or unable to live independently, she wanted her death to happen as soon as possible. She gave some examples, such as not receiving antibiotics if she got pneumonia, not being encouraged to eat if she lost her appetite, and so on. Ms. Snyder took some months to adjust to the nursing home, but she eventually settled in quite well. She does not appear to have physical pain, and she likes the food. She was allowed to bring her cat, to whom she is devoted. She likes the staff, although she can't remember their names, and she often smiles at them and strokes their arms. She especially enjoys the music sessions, where she claps to the music and moves in time in her wheelchair. One day, as an experiment, her nephew showed her a clip of her old self on television, and she showed no recognition that she even recognized that reporter as herself. Now, Madame Snyder has come down with pneumonia. Larry reminds the staff that by the terms of her directive, she should be given no antibiotics, just comfort care, just keep her clean and warm and comfortable. Larry feels a little bit uncomfortable about this because he appreciates that her current life is quite a nice one. But he is sustained in his course of action by the decades of memories of his fiercely independent aunt and by the promises that he made to her when he agreed to be her healthcare proxy, her spokesperson. But the nursing staff and other caregivers are outraged by Larry's refusal. They have no experience of the independent younger Madame Snyder, but they do have 5 years of experience of this very pleasant woman enjoying her life, making personal connections. After all, they see Ms. Snyder on a daily basis, whereas Larry, who lives in another city, visits maybe once a month. Were Larry refusing a burdensome therapy, such as surgery or dialysis, they would understand. But a simple antibiotic? They are sure that the present Mrs. Snyder would prefer to go on living, and their professional and moral duty is to support her continued health. when a temporary physician takes over the night shift, they simply tell him that Madame Snyder has symptoms of pneumonia and please give her an antibiotic, and he does, and she recovers and enjoys 2 more years in the nursing home until dying of a stroke. So does that clear up the problem? Yeah? Okay. So some ethicists, most notably Rebecca Dresser and the late John Robertson, but others, believe that we should ignore the directive of Jane number 1 because it adversely affects the interests of the current Jane number 2. Jane number 1 is gone, and Jane number 2 no longer values things such as autonomy and independence. She values a friendly staff, chocolate pudding for lunch, stroking her cat, and so on. Dresser and Robertson think Americans are too obsessed with what would Jane have wanted if she could tell us. And instead, we should be more focused on what is Jane's best interest now. Bonnie Steinbach is an ethicist who disagrees. She argues that disregarding the directive is treating Jane too as if she had never been competent. Sometimes we have this. We have someone who is born, say, with Down syndrome, someone who is developmentally disabled, and eventually they become old, but they've never really been a competent person to make these kinds of decisions. And Steinbach says, well, that's not the way Jane is, right? We don't want to treat Jane, it's wrong to treat Jane as if she was never a competent person with her own ideas. That's illogical, says Steinbach, and disrespectful. On a less intellectual plane, trying to respect the wishes of someone like Madame Snyder can become snagged on the reality of the moral distress experienced by Ms. Snyder's caregivers. As I said, they have no experience of the younger, independent Ms. Snyder. They do have 5 years of experience of Ms. Snyder number 2. It certainly seems to be in the interests of the current Ms. Snyder to take the antibiotics, recover from the pneumonia, and continue to enjoy her life. Moral distress occurs when a person knows the course of action she believes she ought to take, but she is constrained from doing the right thing or forced to do the wrong thing by legal, institutional, financial, or other obstacles. I think we've all experienced this kind of moral distress at some point in our lives. Moral distress can cause acute discomfort, leading to burnout, lack of job satisfaction, physical symptoms like headaches or ulcers, and so on. Just as it is prima facie wrong to cause physical distress to others, it's prima facie wrong to cause moral distress. After all, moral distress stems from the sufferer's sincere desire to do the right thing. Avoiding moral distress is an important ethical goal, not only because we should always attempt to avoid causing distress to others, but because it seems especially wrong to inflict suffering based on the other person's conscience. In the healthcare literature, moral distress is most often attributed to nurses. This is not surprising because nurses are often caught in the middle. They are high enough on the professional ladder to have a code of ethics and a deep sense of responsibility to their patients, but often not high enough to exert real control over their work environment. To the extent that moral suffering is unequally experienced by those who lack power, causing moral suffering becomes an issue of justice, as well as of non-maleficence, or not doing harm. In a nursing home, for example, decisions may be made by physicians who spend little time there, but moral distress may be experienced by nurses and other caregivers who are more intimately acquainted with the patients and families. Okay, as we can see in the case of Ms. Snyder, there is a real disconnect in how we expect caregivers to behave. A disconnect that mirrors in some way the disconnect between the present Ms. Snyder and her former self. We want caregivers to be gentle and loving and caring, to try to make Ms. Snyder happy, to bring her her favorite foods and sing to her her favorite songs. Most caregiving advice for people with dementia is not to try to contradict them and to orient them to time and place. If they believe that President Reagan is currently in office or that long-gone friends are still alive, caregivers should just go with the flow, not try and shake them back to reality. But then at some point, an advance directive may kick in. Perhaps the person has reached a downward milestone specified in the directive, such as, quote, when I can no longer recognize my family members, then I don't want to live any longer. And then the ghost of the previous competent person is suddenly resurrected and is calling the shots or directing what happens. If I imagine myself as Ms. Snyder's daughter, this might not be so difficult. To me, the competent Ms. Snyder may be the real one, based on my lifelong experience with her. But to the caregiver who arrived in the household to deal with Ms. Snyder's increasing dementia, or to the worker in the nursing home, this previous Ms. Snyder number one, represented now only by a signature on a piece of paper, seems to have no standing to direct the course of what is left of her life. Thus, we see that there are many reasons why following the wishes of the original competent Madame Snyder, or Jane number one, would cause moral distress to her many caregivers. Although moral distress is not as commonly associated with people in power, such as physicians or nursing home administrators, they also are vulnerable to moral distress if they feel that a soulless law, a law without soul, requires them to act against their professional instincts by allowing Ms. Snyder to die. Although I have compassion for people who feel moral distress and who experience it precisely because they are admirable, caring people of conscience doing a job that I couldn't do even for a day, I am even more concerned about the threat the identity problem and moral distress causes to precedent autonomy. Precedent autonomy meaning pushing forward into the future an autonomy that I feel now. Does that make sense? Precedent autonomy?
I don't understand that.
Okay, precedent meaning future. So now I am, competent person talking to you. I'm worried, maybe in 20 years I'll have Alzheimer's. Then I won't have any autonomy. So now I write a directive that directs what happens 20 years from now. That's precedent autonomy. Autonomy moving forward into my future. Okay.
C'est bon pour tout le monde?
Okay. So, medical personnel who oppose advance directives can make it almost impossible for those directives to prevail. They could say, for example, that Ms. Snyder has the right, through her proxy, her nephew, to refuse the antibiotic, but that the nursing home has the right to refuse to continue to care for her if the proxy doesn't follow medical advice. Sure, you can say no to the antibiotic, but then you're out on the street. That's not very helpful. They could give the antibiotics without telling Larry, knowing that the legal consequences are virtually never serious. For who will sue and for what injury? Wrongful life suits like this are rarely successful. So what does this mean for those of us who would want to cut our lives short should we experience irreversible dementia? I believe it means that we cannot count on having our advance directives followed, no matter how carefully they are written, for two reasons. First, that there are too many people who believe, as Dresser and Robertson do, that Jane number 1 is a different person from Jane number 2. And secondly, because of the moral distress of caregivers who experience Jane number 2, but not Jane number 1. So for those two reasons, I think that advance directives to end one's life as soon as possible, should one become demented, are not to be relied on. So a combination of the then self, now self identity problem and the moral distress may lead to our wishes not being respected. Therefore, ending our own lives before we become demented, if we are lucky and clever enough to do so, seems to be the only sure way to avoid years and years of dementia. Thank you.
C'est très intéressant. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions?
Je voudrais faire un petit résumé par vous.
Une synthèse, si vous voulez.
Parce qu'il y avait le point qui est essentiel, que Jane 1 avait dit deux choses quand elle était jeune. Elle a dit, si j'ai une pneumonie, ne me donne pas des antibiotiques, ça c'est complètement différent que si j'ai besoin d'avoir une nephrectomie, je ne veux pas, ou si je deviens complètement incapacité, c'est pas possible. In English, what I'm saying is that what she said when she was when she was Jane 1 normal, was two extremes. Because I just finished taking care of my mother-in-law who died after 10 years in a nursing home, okay? And all the nurses and all the doctors and all the people that work, toutes les personnes qui travaillent dans un EHPAD ou un soin à domicile, excuse me for, sont capables de discuter ensemble avec la famille et déterminer ce qui est mineur et ce qui est majeur. Et d'habitude, c'est le médecin, la famille et les infirmières qui travaillent ensemble pour prendre une décision si c'est quelque chose de majeur. Mais Jane 1 that you talked about, for aspirins for pneumonia, les ampicillines pour une pneumonie, ce n'est pas, c'est une déclaration de colère, okay, ou de mineur absolument d'aucune valeur par rapport de si elle avait vraiment quelque chose majeur qui aurait...
I'm not sure I'm exactly following you, so...
I'm sorry, I'm just saying one thing, when someone says something early when they're in their age, and it's very minor, like taking aspirins, taking antibiotics for some type of flu or some type of infection, that's very minor, as compared to if something happens to you that is major, then you can say, I don't want to live.
That was exactly the point that was exactly the point I was making, that the problem, that one of the problems that stands between Jane and what she wanted was that the antibiotics seemed so minor. That's exactly right. Had she been saying no dialysis, no heart transplant, of course, everyone would agree. The problem is that, and this goes back a bit to some things Dennis was saying, there are some of us who, if we become demented, want to die as quickly as possible. And an antibiotic, so we would rather die of pneumonia and not take an antibiotic. And the problem is that the antibiotic doesn't seem...
Oui, d'accord. Ok, mais c'est-à-dire, à l'époque, Jane, après je vous donne, parce que c'est la deuxième fois que monsieur vous parle, je veux simplement, I would just like to know, Jane 1 was not demented when she made her first...
Absolutely not.
Okay, no, voilà. So therefore her statement about antibiotics was not really important.
Well, why do you say it wasn't important?
Because she was just angry, and it was a very much...
She wasn't angry at all. She was making a... Why do you say angry?
Because someone who says, if I get pneumonia, don't give me antibiotics, has nothing to do with someone who says, if I become demented, don't let me live any longer. It's two, one is an extreme, and after you've gone to go, après vous êtes visité des maisons, des EHPAD et tout ça, vous savez très bien qu'il y a certaines personnes qui sont malades et ils veulent être bien traités pour leur maladie jusqu'à un certain point. Et après, ni la famille, ni personne ne veut voir leurs parents complètement handicapés ou perdus. C'est une grande différence entre une infection et un véritable problème.
So you agree with me that the only thing Jane can do is end her life while she still has the competence to do so, in case somebody like you comes along and...
No, Larry should have said to her, listen, Jane,
Attends, on va être débordé, on avait dit qu'on ne posait pas de questions, parce que c'est ce qu'on a fait depuis 2 jours. Mais là, ça imprime un autre style, et on va être complètement débordé, et on rentre dans une autre forme, qui n'est pas la nôtre. Alors, éventuellement, vous pouvez vous poser votre question, et ça sera la dernière, si vous voulez.
I just wanted to say that your example is dramatically good, but your conclusions are very complicated, because in France we dramatically lack of anticipated directives, and they do help us greatly. Another question is that you said that she was competent first phase and then she was not. Are you sure? Maybe she did not know what was Jane number 2. She did not recognize the possibility of being happy as being Alzheimer. And therefore, I do not agree when you said when you say we just ignore these anticipated directives. They were not ignored; they were taken into account with the rest. So I'm sorry for being so long. Your intervention was very
très bonne remarque. Very good remarque.
So I agree. You're bringing up a really important point that no one's entirely competent because no one has experienced everything. And right, that's what you're saying. And that Jane 1 doesn't know what it's going to be like to be Jane 2. And we may disagree on how to deal with that fact, but I think that's a really important point. Yes.
Il y a plein de questions.